Well, joining us now to talk about that and all the other news, Rana Foroohar, the assistant managing editor of Time magazine, and scored an exclusive with the new Fed Chair Janet Yellen for this week's issue. Michael Gerson, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, he's now a Washington Post columnist. Gerald Seib, Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, and we're also joined by our old friend, the editor-in-chief of Politico, John Harris. Jerry, let me just start for you. I mean, this Iraq, the news just gets worse by the day. Is this whole thing about to fall in?
Well, it's worse than that, actually, because it's a regional problem. What you're seeing really is the sectarian strife of the Syrian civil war now seep across the borders back into Iraq, where it was under control at one point, and across the border into Lebanon. And you have Sunni Shiite civil wars breaking out in many different ways on many different levels. For the U.S., obviously, the conundrum here is, what do you do? We just spent more than a decade in this country. Fallujah, a town that we liberated twice, seems to have fallen to al-Qaeda-supported Sunni militias. What do you do about that? There's a piece I noticed in the Washington Post today, which a retired general proposes that the U.S. Provide air support to the Iraqi government to help turn this tide back around the other way. But I don't think there's a lot of appetite for that. I noticed when you asked Senator Rubio about it, he said fairly quickly, we're not going back into Iraq.
I can't imagine, can you, Michael, that we would in any way provide military support into Iraq?
Well, not directly, but there are a lot of grades of things you could do to support proxies in the region, whether it's Afghanistan, in Syria, or in Iraq. I thought that was the most effective part of Senator Rubio's critique. That really, you know, in the Gates book, we're seeing now the real-world results of an ambivalent American policy. You know, 100,000 people dead in Syria, 6 million people homeless, al-Qaeda safe havens all across the region. That we've seen there in the last decade, there are risks to engagement in the Middle East, but we're also seeing risks to disengagement and a failed policy in the Middle East. And I think that Republicans are increasingly going to try to hold the president accountable for that.
You know, I do want to talk about this story. I'm not sure it's the big story of the week, but the one that's getting so much attention, and that is Chris Christie. But since you brought up the Gates book and his criticism, John, what do you make of this? I have said a lot of what Secretary Gates says in his criticism, I frankly agree with, but I was really surprised that he said it.
Well, there is a classic tension in Washington, I suppose, and everywhere else between truth and loyalty. Those are two conflicting values. Obviously, Bob Gates made a decision to proceed on the in favor of truth, at least as he saw it. It was, I completely agree that it was a surprise. He's somebody who is a consummate establishment figure, but quietly in the establishment. Look, every president has to make judgments as he looks at his or maybe someday her team. Which side are these people on? There's kind of two stripes of people in Washington. There are loyalists who are loyalists to the end, and then there are people who are essentially loyal to the Washington establishment. They're loyal to Bob Woodward, getting their story out. They're loyal to Bob Barnett, who's going to get their book deals. They're loyal to Bob Schieffer because they want the publicity of being on a show like this one. We learned which side Bob Gates is on. It's not on the side of the loyalists. It's on the side of, frankly, Bob Gates. I'm not criticizing what he did, but it did seem to me a move to advance his profile at the expense of the loyalty and the kind of sanctity of the policy process in which he served.
Ron, it really does kind of underline, though, that in Washington, for the president, I don't care who he is or what the ground rules are, there is nothing that in the end is off the record. Oh. People talk to the president in confidence, and then suddenly it shows up in a book.
Absolutely. There is no such thing as off the record. All journalists know that.
You know, I think one of the things that's been lost in the analysis of the Gates book, though, is that he was hard on President Obama in some ways. He was harder on other people. He was harder on Vice President Biden, obviously, very hard on Congress, almost top to bottom, hard on the White House staff. The president almost gets a pass from Bob Gates on some of these things because in the end, Bob Gates says, I agreed with the decisions the president ultimately made in Afghanistan. He, I think, was most upset because he perceived the administration as lacking faith in the uniformed military, and that's really what I think bothered Bob Gates.
When George Stephanopoulos wrote his memoir in the Clinton years, I asked Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, the late historian, what he thought about this. There was a very similar debate, and he said, look, I'm all in favor of this. Let the debate begin. Don't wait till administrations are over. Don't wait till memories are faded and people are dead. Let's have the debate. So there's really compelling views on both sides. We're going to learn about more because of this.
You were there for a lot of this. You were not there when Bob Gates was there working for Barack Obama, but you were there when he was working, Michael, for George Bush. Yeah. Were you surprised by this?
I was. I think this is a man who has completely lost patience with politicians in Washington. And that was a lot of the context of this book. He was not a good picture of the Congress, not a good picture of a politicized, centralized national security structure at the White House. So that, I think, is the context here. But I thought it was a particularly damaging profile because Gates doesn't disagree with Obama on the substance of many of these decisions. He's not making an idealist argument or a realist argument, some kind of ideological critique. He's saying that the president's leadership was flawed. He was conducting missions he didn't believe in. He had a staff that was insular and not very effective. I think that's a pretty effective critique. I don't think he has an ideological axe to grind. He's making a critique of the president's leadership.
Rana, I want to ask you, you had a big scoop this week. You got an interview with Janet Yellen. What should we expect?
Well, she's optimistic. Perhaps the most important thing she said in terms of the economy during the interview was that she and the other Fed governors are hopeful that GDP growth this year is going to be more like 3% rather than 2%. Well, that would be a big shift because that gets us more back towards the historical range that we've become used to. The question is that the Fed is now going to have to do some tricky maneuvering. You know, they've been pumping a lot of money into the economy, currently $75 billion a month. They're going to have to pull that back without derailing the recovery. So she's really got her work cut out for her. And I think that she and the other Fed governors would agree that in a politicized Washington, they're sort of left holding the bag. They're really the biggest institution that can act to make changes in the economy.
What's she like?
She's a real truth seeker. You know, she's an academic. She's married to a Nobel Prize-winning economist as well. Her son is an economist. There's a lot of very heady dinner table conversations in that family. She's somebody who really took the lessons of the Great Depression, as did her predecessor, Ben Bernanke. She grew up, her father was a family doctor in Brooklyn in a working-class neighborhood, and she saw him taking in laborers who would pay $2 or not, depending on how things were going, to be seen. She really understands the human impact of unemployment, and that's something she kept coming back to during our conversation. She's going to be really making sure that those employment numbers start to go down. That's going to be her primary focus. I think she's also going to be tougher in terms of bank reform than what we've seen in the past.
Okay, let's talk about it. A bridge too far. The Chris Christie thing. I mean, where does this go?
You know, I don't know, but about where it goes exactly, but my own theory about why scandals are bad is if they violate one of two principles. The first is if there's a whiff of hypocrisy, and the second is if they seem to confirm some pre-existing perception of a politician. Well, this one does a little bit of both. The pre-existing perception of Chris Christie was that he's a little bit of a bully, and this confirms that to voters. That's a problem. The second problem is on the hypocrisy front. You know, he had portrayed New Jersey as kind of a model of bipartisan cooperation. That didn't seem to be the case when it came to the bridge. So those are two things that give it legs, I think.
Well, you know, one thing about it that was very Chris Christie-like, and that was he just came at it head on.
We'll see where it goes. You know, arguing against Jerry's position a little bit that maybe this doesn't have the long-term resonance. One, I think it is the kind of Dumb and Dumber aspect of it. It is the most entertaining political scandal we've had with no sex angle that I can remember. You know, it's kind of you've got H.R. Haldeman meets Jim Carrey, and it's vastly entertaining. The other thing I've noticed, there was a column in the Washington Post today by Kathleen Parker. I had picked up the same thing. A lot of conservatives who Chris Christie really needs to court because, frankly, he's seen as a more moderate Republican. They don't seem as bothered by this. I've noticed it in my email and my conversations as well. They think there's hypocrisy on the part of the media that this is a lesser scandal than, say, the IRS investigations and so, like, when the media goes into full frenzy mode, actually, Republicans and conservatives tend to rally around the target.
Wait, you were going to say something, Michael.
In an odd way, this is not bad timing for Christie. Presidential candidates often have scandals, DUI, Bush, or bimbo eruptions, or other things. This is well before the election. If there's not anything more here, he's got time. But I would not minimize the fact that this is his closest team. If this team had been transposed to the White House, it would have had Nixonian implications. Putting these people in charge of the Department of Justice and the IRS could have been a serious mistake. Christie now has to prove that he can make adjustments in his inner circle that make that worthy of a presidential run.
I agree with that. I think you can't minimize it, and I think also as people dig into this, if it turns out that there really is a pattern, if there are other incidents of bullying, there's been discussion about a Rutgers professor who didn't support certain policies, who lost funding. If there turns out to be a real pattern, I think that this will stick and be a lasting problem.
But won't his main problem be when he goes into places like South Carolina, convincing them he's a conservative? I mean, in the end, won't that be what will be the deciding point as to whether he gets the nomination or not?
I think so. I mean, he's not got the profile that necessarily fits the Republican Party of today in terms of primary politics. And when the base turns out, they're not necessarily looking for a guy like Chris Christie, either stylistically or in terms of his substance.
His hope was that he could replace ideological purity, which you won't have, with character, i.e. toughness and personal rectitude, and that would satisfy the concerns of those more conservative voters. That's where it's a little hard to...
Let's talk a little bit about Marco Rubio, because he obviously is somebody, you heard him say this morning, he's going to make a decision next year as to whether he's going to do it or not. Obviously, he is already checking around and seeing how the ground is there, looking for that ground swell. I think it's a little early to see a swell, but people are talking about it. What do you think?
Well, I think that to go to Mike's point, he had a bad year in a sense in 2013 because he made a big push on immigration. The party kind of pushed back pretty hard. But, in a way, he's now moved to new issues. Poverty is an interesting one. Lots of people in the party want to talk about the debate between Democrats who want to talk about income inequality and Republicans who say the issue here is upward mobility, and why isn't there upward mobility in society? Well, he's gotten out in front of that issue. He's got plenty of time to become the presidential contender that a lot of people thought he would be.
But you know what? If he wants to really use this idea of an opportunity society as a platform point, I think that the Republicans are going to have to sharpen those arguments, because the truth is that mobility in America has been decreasing, and particularly relative to Europe. But one of the reasons for that is that a number of European nations do have more government support around things like education, healthcare. One of the top reasons, in fact, that a third of Americans cycle in and out of poverty is because they're having a healthcare emergency every year. So this is a very nuanced topic, and rather than just talk, you need to see really well-honed policies.
The Senate, I guess, votes tomorrow on whether to extend unemployment benefits. Does anybody have a prediction on where that's going? Is that going to happen? The class, it will be noted.
I'm hoping it's going to happen. I hope
remain silent.
I hope it's going to happen because, we're still in the weakest recovery of the post-war period. There are a historically high number of people that have been out of a job for a long period of time. And that has not just an economic impact, but a social impact. The research shows that when people are out of a job, when the breadwinner can't work, children suffer, their test scores go down, divorce rates are higher. This is a real social problem. And I think that just saying that, everyone can move up the ladder and kind of forwarding that mythology is not fixing it.
And when you put this money back in, a lot of these unemployment benefits do go back into the economy.
That's right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is an economy made up of 70% consumer spending, so people don't have money in their pockets.
The minimum wage, do any of you think that we'll see the minimum wage increase this year?
I don't.
You don't?
I find it hard to see the bipartisan agreement on that.
I think we might, because I think Republicans might make a pragmatic decision. It's just not worth fighting about. They've done something similar in the past when this came up. Only 3% of the workforce has covered it. They might say, look, this is not the place to wage an ideological battle, even one that I think most conservatives do agree with. That it's not job producing, but in fact is job depressing.
Yeah, I think on this broader issue you're correct, but both sides are going to have to make some concessions here, because you're not going to achieve social mobility just with income transfer, just by expanding programs. And you're not going to achieve it by just, economic growth and focusing on the family. You're going to have to address the influence of technology and globalization and a lot of and also family issues and some kind of conservative issues, and do it in a comprehensive way. I'm glad Republicans have started talking about this. It's not just Rubio, it's also Cantor and Ryan and Mike Lee from Utah. Their policies are a little thin and tentative at this point. The question is whether they can rise to that, and they're going to need to have a national appeal in 2016.
Well, one thing you'll be happy to know, Janet Yellen told me she's thinking a lot about globalization and technology and its job impact. So.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. And when we come back, we're going to talk to Sully Sullenberger.